A young widow arrives at a remote mountain cabin with twin babies and a marriage contract, only to find her new home burned to ashes and her promised husband nowhere to be found. But when a mysterious scarred mountain man emerges from the wilderness, he sees not another burden to bear, but a family worth protecting at any cost. This is a story about finding sanctuary in the most unexpected places and discovering that sometimes the deepest scars hide the most generous hearts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain air bit sharp and cold as the supply wagon lurched to a halt beside a pile of charred timber and twisted metal that had once been a home. Margaret Maggie O'Brien clutched her 6-month-old twins closer, her breath forming small clouds in the thin September air as she stared at the destruction before her. Little Rose whimpered against her shoulder while her brother Patrick slept fitfully, both babies exhausted from the grueling 3-day journey up treacherous mountain paths. "This can't be right," Maggie whispered, her Irish accent thick with disbelief. The cabin was supposed to be their new beginning, a fresh start after losing everything in the Boston tenements following her husband's death in a factory fire. Henrik, the grizzled supply driver who had agreed to transport her up the mountain for the last of her savings, removed his worn hat and scratched his grey head. "This here's the Brennan place, miss, or what's left of it." His weathered face creased with sympathy as he took in the scene. "Fire looks to be maybe 2-3 weeks old. Lightning strike, most likely, judging by that split pine over yonder." Maggie's heart sank as she realized the implications. Thomas Brennan, the lumber mill foreman who had answered her advertisement for correspondence and eventual marriage, had written detailed letters about his sturdy 2-room cabin, his steady work, and his eagerness to provide for a ready-made family. His last letter, creased and worn from constant handling, was tucked safely in her coat pocket alongside their marriage contract, signed by proxy just before she'd left Boston. At 26, Maggie had already survived more hardship than most. Women twice her age, the fever that took her parents when she was 16, the struggle to support herself as a seamstress in Boston's garment district, her brief but happy marriage to Sean O'Brien, a kind dock worker who'd given her 2 beautiful children before perishing in an industrial accident just months before their birth. Left alone with mounting debts and no family, she'd made the desperate decision to answer Thomas Brennan's advertisement for a mail-order bride willing to venture into the Colorado Territory mountains. "What am I to do now?" she asked aloud, though she wasn't really expecting Henrik to have answers. Her entire savings had gone toward the train fare to Denver and the wagon transport up the mountain. She had perhaps $3 left to her. Name and nowhere to go, with 2 helpless infants as autumn settled over the high country. Henrik climbed down from his wagon seat, his joints creaking audibly in the cold air. "Well, I reckon we ought to look around for sign of what happened to Brennan. Man might have had time to get out, could be staying somewhere nearby." They spent the better part of an hour searching through the debris, but found no trace of Thomas Brennan or any indication of where he might have gone. The chimney stood like a lonely sentinel among the ashes, and scattered around the clearing were the remnants of a life abruptly ended. A partially melted coffee pot, the twisted remains of a bed frame, fragments of dishes and household goods. As the afternoon light began to fade behind the towering pines, Henrik's expression grew increasingly troubled. "Miss, I hate to say it, but I got to start back down the mountain before dark. These trails ain't safe after sunset, especially with weather moving in." He gestured toward the heavy gray clouds gathering on the western peaks. "You can't leave us here," Maggie said, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "Surely there's somewhere nearby, another cabin or settlement." Henrik shook his head reluctantly. "Nearest neighbor is the Dawson Ranch, but that's a hard day's Right southeast through country that'll eat you alive if you don't know it. Milltown's even farther, and winter comes early up here. Could snow any day now. The reality of her situation crashed over Maggie like an avalanche. She was stranded in the wilderness with 2 infants, no shelter and no means of survival. The temperature was already dropping as the sun sank lower, and she could see her breath more clearly with each passing minute. "Please," she began, but Henrik was already shaking his head. "I'm sorry, miss. Truly I am. But I got my own family to think about, and if I don't make it down tonight, we could all end up trapped up here by weather. These mountain storms come fast and mean." He climbed back onto his wagon seat, his face etched with genuine regret. "I'll tell folks in town about your situation soon as I get back. Maybe someone can organize a rescue party." As the wagon disappeared down the narrow mountain trail, its wheels crunching on fallen leaves and loose stones, Maggie found herself truly alone for the first time in her life. The silence of the high country was profound and intimidating, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. She walked carefully through the ruins of what was to have been her new home, searching for anything salvageable. In what had been the kitchen area, she found a dented but intact water bucket and a few canning jars that had somehow survived the flames. Near where the front door would have been, half buried under debris, she discovered a leather satchel containing some basic tools and a small amount of jerky wrapped in oiled cloth. As darkness began to settle over the mountains, bringing with it a bone-deep cold that made the babies fuss and cry, Maggie realized she needed to find shelter immediately. The night temperatures at this altitude could easily drop below freezing, and she had only the clothes on her back and a single wool blanket she'd used to wrap the twins during the journey. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. About 50 yards from the cabin ruins, she spotted a large fallen pine that had created a natural lean-to against a boulder. It wasn't much, but it would provide some protection from the wind. She gathered armfuls of pine needles and smaller branches to create a makeshift bed, then huddled with the twins against the massive tree trunk, pulling her thin coat and the wool blanket around all 3 of them. Rose and Patrick cried intermittently from cold and hunger, and Maggie found herself singing softly to them in Gaelic the ancient lullabies her own mother had sung. Her voice carried clearly in the still mountain air, a lonely sound that seemed to emphasize their isolation rather than comfort it. As the temperature continued to drop and frost began forming on the fallen leaves around their shelter, Maggie wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Perhaps she should have stayed in Boston, found some other way to survive. At least there she wouldn't have doomed her children to freezing to death in the wilderness. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, a part of her spirit refused to surrender. She'd survived too much, fought too hard, to give up now. Somehow, some way, she would find a solution. She had to, for Rose and Patrick's sake. The sound came first as a distant crashing through the underbrush, rhythmic and purposeful. Maggie's eyes snapped open in the pre-dawn darkness, her heart hammering as she realized something large was moving through the forest toward their makeshift shelter. A bear, perhaps, or a mountain lion drawn by the scent of helpless prey. She gathered the twins closer, trying to muffle their soft sounds while straining to locate the source of the noise. The footsteps were too regular for a wild animal, she realized, with a mixture of relief and new fear. Human, but who would be traveling these remote trails in the dark? A figure emerged from the tree line like something out of a fever dream. Tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness. In the faint starlight, she could make out long, dark hair and what appeared to be buckskin clothing. As he drew closer, she saw that the left side of his face was marked by scars that extended down his neck and disappeared beneath his shirt. He stopped about 10 feet away, his hands visible and empty, clearly having spotted their shelter. When he spoke, his voice was deep and surprisingly gentle despite his intimidating appearance. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" He made no move to come closer, respecting the distance while assessing the situation. "Saw the smoke from the Brennan place yesterday. Came to investigate." Maggie's throat was so dry from cold and fear that she could barely speak. "The cabin burned," she managed. "Thomas Brennan. I was to marry him, but—" "Brennan's dead," the stranger said quietly. "Found his body about a mile down the ravine 3 days ago. Looks like he was trying to get water when the fire started. Must have fallen and hit his head on the rocks." The news, though not entirely unexpected, still hit Maggie like a physical blow. Her last hope of a conventional solution to their predicament had just vanished. She closed her eyes, feeling tears freeze on her cheeks in the bitter cold. "You got little ones there," the man observed, his tone carefully neutral. "They need warmth and food, and this weather's about to turn nasty. Big storm coming in from the west." "I know," Maggie whispered. "I don't know what to do. The supply—" "Driver left us here yesterday, said he'd send help from town, but—" "Town's 4 days away in good weather," the stranger said matter-of-factly. "And Henrik won't be getting through to anybody with this storm moving in. Could be snowed in for weeks once it hits." As if to emphasize his point, the first fat snowflakes began drifting down from the dark sky, landing on the fallen leaves, with tiny whispered sounds. Within minutes, the snow was falling steadily, and Maggie could feel the temperature dropping even further. "My name's Caleb Stone," the man said, moving slowly closer while keeping his hands visible. "I've got a cabin about 2 miles north of here built for winter weather. You and the babies need to come with me now, before this storm gets worse." Every instinct Maggie possessed screamed warnings about following a strange man into the wilderness, especially one whose scars suggested a violent past. But as she looked down at Rose and Patrick, both beginning to shiver despite being wrapped in every piece of clothing she possessed, she realized she had no choice. They would certainly die of exposure if they remained here, while this Caleb Stone at least offered the possibility of survival. "I don't even know you," she said, though she was already gathering their few possessions. "No, ma'am, you don't," he agreed. "But I know what it's like to lose everything and need help from strangers. And I know those babies won't last another hour in this cold." There was something in his voice, a note of understanding born from personal experience, that decided her. She allowed him to help her to her feet, accepting his steadying hand while clutching the twins against her chest. "Can you walk?" he asked, noting how she swayed slightly from exhaustion and cold. "I'll manage," she said with more confidence than she felt. Caleb nodded, then surprised her by shrugging out of his heavy fur-lined coat and draping it around her shoulders. "For the babies," he said simply, though she could see his own breath misting in the frigid air. The journey to his cabin was a nightmare of stumbling through darkness over rough terrain, while snow fell increasingly heavily around them. Caleb moved ahead of them, breaking trail and holding back branches, occasionally offering his arm when the path became particularly treacherous. He spoke little, but Maggie began to notice small kindnesses in his actions. The way he always positioned himself between her and the steepest drops. How he'd pause whenever one of the babies cried, giving her time to comfort them before continuing. When they finally reached his cabin, Maggie nearly wept with relief. It was larger and more solidly built than she'd expected, constructed of thick logs chinked with stone and mortar. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising blessed warmth, and yellow light glowed welcomingly in the windows. "Home," Caleb said simply, opening the heavy wooden door and gesturing for her to enter first. The interior was a revelation, clean and well-organized, with handmade furniture that spoke of considerable skill and attention to detail. A fire burned brightly in a large stone fireplace, and the single large room was divided into functional areas. A kitchen with a proper stove, a sitting area with comfortable chairs, and a sleeping alcove partially curtained for privacy. "Sit by the fire," Caleb instructed, moving to stoke the flames higher. "Get those babies warm while I fix something hot to drink." Maggie sank into a chair near the hearth, finally allowing herself to believe they might actually survive. As warmth began to penetrate her frozen limbs, the twins stopped their distressed whimpering and began to relax in her arms. She watched covertly as Caleb moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency, preparing what smelled like beef broth and coffee. His scarred face was more visible in the firelight, and she could see that whatever had happened to him had been severe. The marks extended from his left temple down to his jaw and continued beneath his shirt collar, suggesting extensive burns or perhaps claw marks from a wild animal. Yet, despite his intimidating appearance, his movements around the domestic space were gentle and careful. He handled the delicate china cups and cooking utensils with the same dexterity other men might reserve for weapons or tools. "Here," he said, offering her a steaming mug of broth. "Drink slow. You're probably more dehydrated than you think." The hot liquid was like a miracle, warming her from the inside and providing the first real nourishment she'd had since early, the previous morning. As she sipped gratefully, she became aware that Caleb was studying the twins with an odd expression on his scarred features. "How old?" he asked quietly. 6 months, Maggie replied. "Rose and Patrick, they're all I have left in the world." Something flickered in Caleb's dark eyes at her words, a recognition of loss that made her wonder what tragedies had brought him to this isolated mountain existence. "They're beautiful," he said simply, and she could hear the genuine emotion in his voice. "Lucky to have a mother brave enough to cross half a continent for their sake." The unexpected kindness in his words nearly undid her completely. After days of fear and uncertainty, weeks of desperate planning, and months of grinding poverty and worry, his simple acknowledgement of her efforts as a mother touched something deep in her heart. "I don't know how to repay your kindness," she said when she could trust her voice again. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his words surprised her. "Maybe you don't need to repay anything. Maybe sometimes helping others is just what people do when they remember what it's like to need help themselves." Outside, the storm had intensified. Wind howling around the solid cabin walls, while snow piled steadily against the windows. But inside, for the first time since leaving Boston, Maggie felt safe. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever this strange, scarred mountain man's story might be, tonight her children were warm and fed and protected. And sometimes, she thought, as exhaustion finally claimed her, that was enough to build hope upon. Morning light filtered through frost-covered windows, casting intricate patterns across the cabin floor where Maggie had spent her first night of real sleep in weeks. She woke to the sound of gentle crackling from the fireplace and the rich aroma of coffee brewing on the wood stove. For a moment, she lay still in the comfortable bed where Caleb had insisted she sleep while he took the floor near the fire, simply marveling at the sensation of being truly warm. Rose and Patrick stirred in the makeshift crib Caleb had fashioned. From a wooden crate lined with soft furs, their small sounds of awakening, bringing Maggie fully alert. As she sat up, she realized her host was already dressed and moving quietly around the cabin, clearly having been awake for some time. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. Caleb turned from where he'd been preparing what looked like a substantial breakfast. In the clear morning light, she could see his scars more distinctly, but also noticed how they seemed to fade in importance when he smiled, which he did now with genuine warmth. "Morning. Storm's passed, but left us about 2 feet of snow. We'll be snowed in for a few days at least." He gestured toward the window, where brilliant white stretched as far as the eye could see. "Hope you don't mind the company." The twins began their morning routine of demanding immediate attention, and Maggie moved to tend to them, acutely aware that she had no clean clothes for them and precious little in the way of supplies. Caleb seemed to sense her distress without her saying anything. "There's a trunk in the corner there," he said, nodding toward a large cedar chest. "Has some things that might be useful, baby clothes and such." Maggie's eyes widened in surprise. "Baby clothes? But how?" A shadow passed over Caleb's features, and he was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Had a family once, wife and a little girl. They're gone now, but some of their things, well, seemed wrong to just get rid of everything." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Maggie felt her heart contract with sympathy. Here was a man who understood loss in the most profound way possible, yet he was sharing these precious remnants of his past with her children. "I couldn't," she began, but he cut her off with a gentle but firm shake of his head. "Those clothes were meant for a baby. Your babies need them now. Sarah would have wanted that." His voice caught slightly on the name, then steadied. "She always said children were the most important thing in the world, that everything else was just details." With trembling hands, Maggie opened the trunk to find it carefully organized with tiny dresses, baby blankets, and small garments that had clearly been made with loving care. Everything was clean and well preserved, wrapped in lavender sachets that filled the air with a gentle floral scent. As she changed the twins into warm, dry clothes that fit them perfectly, she found herself blinking back tears, not just from gratitude, but from recognition of the immense trust Caleb was showing by sharing these intimate reminders of his lost family. "Tell me about them," she said softly, as she dressed Rose in a tiny yellow dress that brought out the baby's auburn hair. "If you want to, I mean." Caleb poured coffee into 2 cups, his movements deliberate and controlled. "Met my wife, Elizabeth, in Denver. She was a schoolteacher, smartest woman I ever knew, could read and write better than most men, and wasn't afraid to speak her mind about anything." A small smile touched his lips at the memory. "Said she was going to civilize me, whether I liked it or not." He handed Maggie a cup of coffee and settled into the chair across from her, watching as she fed the twins their morning bottles. Sarah was 2 when the fever took them both. Scarlet fever. Swept through the valley that winter, took near half the children in the area. "I'm so sorry," Maggie said, meaning it deeply. "How long ago?" 3 years now. Been up here alone since then, mostly." He gestured around the cabin. "Built this place for them. Wanted Elizabeth to have a proper home instead of that tiny place we had in town. Finished it just before they died." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. A home built for family, now sheltering a different family in need. Maggie could see the careful craftsmanship in every detail of the cabin, from the smoothly fitted logs to the elegant stone fireplace. This was a home built with love and hope for the future. "They would be proud of what you've built here," she said, looking around at the beautiful space, "and proud of the man who opened his door to strangers in a storm." Caleb's scarred face flushed slightly at the compliment. "Elizabeth always said I was too soft-hearted for mountain living. Guess she was right about that too." As the morning progressed, Maggie began to understand that Caleb's kindness extended far beyond simple hospitality. He had clearly given up his own bed without a second thought, had shared precious mementos of his family, and was now preparing to care for 3 additional people for an indefinite period without any expectation of compensation. "I should explain my situation properly," she said, as they sat down to a breakfast of bacon, eggs, and fresh biscuits that rivaled anything she'd tasted in the finest Boston restaurants. "I came here to marry Thomas Brennan, but obviously that's no longer possible. I have very little money and nowhere else to go." "I figured as much," Caleb said matter-of-factly. "Question is, what do you want to do now?" The simple directness of his question caught her off guard. Most men would have immediately begun discussing arrangements for getting rid of the inconvenient woman and children who had disrupted their solitude. Instead, Caleb seemed genuinely interested in her plans and preferences. "I don't know," she admitted. "I suppose I'll have to find some way to get back to civilization, look for work somewhere, but with the babies—" She trailed off, the practical difficulties seeming insurmountable. "What kind of work did you do before?" Caleb asked, cutting his biscuit with careful precision. "I was a seamstress in Boston, worked in a garment factory. Before that, I helped my mother with her dressmaking business. I can read and write, keep accounts, and I'm good with my hands." She paused, then added with a touch of pride, "I can make patterns and alter clothes to fit anyone, and I'm not afraid of hard work." Something sparked in Caleb's eyes at this information. "Interesting. You know, there's not a decent seamstress within 100 miles of here. Folks have to make do with whatever they can piece together, or order things from Denver and hope they fit." "You're thinking I could set up business here?" Maggie asked, surprised by the possibility. "Why not? There's families scattered all through these mountains, miners and ranchers and loggers. Most of them would pay good money for proper clothes, especially the women who are tired of wearing men's cast-offs or trying to make do with fabric that wasn't meant for mountain living." The idea had never occurred to her, but as Caleb explained, the isolation of mountain communities and the scarcity of skilled tradespeople, she began to see the potential. A seamstress with proper training could indeed make a good living, serving the scattered population of the high country. "But I'd need supplies, fabric, thread, proper sewing machines," she pointed out, "and somewhere to work, somewhere to live." Supplies could be ordered through the mining company. They bring wagons up regularly. As for the rest—" Caleb hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "There's a room at the back of this cabin that was meant to be Elizabeth's sewing. Room has good light, plenty of space, and this place is big enough for a family." The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither wanted to examine too closely. Maggie felt her heart skip a beat at the possibility he was suggesting. Not just work, but a home, a partnership of some kind. "You'd let us stay?" she asked carefully. "With the babies and all the disruption that brings?" Caleb's expression grew serious as he looked at Rose and Patrick, both now content and drowsy after their feeding. "This house was built for children's laughter," he said quietly. "Been too quiet for too long. And you're right that babies bring disruption. They also bring life and purpose and joy." Over the following days, as the snow gradually melted and revealed the true beauty of their mountain valley, Maggie began to see how such an arrangement might work. Caleb was gone much of each day, checking his trap lines and hunting for game that provided both their meals and valuable pelts for trading. During these times, she explored the cabin more thoroughly and discovered that Elizabeth's sewing room was indeed perfect for her purposes. The room had large windows facing south for optimal light, built-in storage for supplies, and even a sturdy table that could serve as a cutting surface. More importantly, it was clearly a space that had been designed by someone who understood the needs of a working seamstress. When Caleb returned each evening, he would help with the twins in ways that surprised her. He seemed naturally comfortable with babies, holding them with practiced ease while she prepared dinner, entertaining them with simple toys he carved from scraps of wood. Patrick was particularly fascinated by a small wooden horse Caleb made. while Rose preferred a set of smooth wooden rings that she could grasp and chew safely. "You're good with them," Maggie observed one evening as she watched him patiently help Patrick practice sitting up unsupported. "Had practice with Sarah," he replied simply. "Babies are babies, doesn't matter whose they are. They need the same things: food, warmth, attention, and someone to love them unconditionally." The casual way he included her children in that last category made Maggie's throat tighten with emotion. In just a few days, this scarred, solitary mountain man had shown more genuine care for Rose and Patrick than their own grandfather ever had. As autumn progressed into early winter, their household settled into routines that felt surprisingly natural. Maggie spent her days caring for the twins and beginning to set up her sewing room, while Caleb managed the practical necessities of mountain living, hunting, maintaining their firewood supply, and making sure they had adequate food. Stores for the harsh months ahead. Evenings were spent around the fire, with Maggie mending their clothes or working on small sewing projects while Caleb carved or repaired equipment. They talked about their pasts, their hopes for the future, and the day-to-day challenges of their current situation. Gradually, Maggie learned more about the accident that had scarred him, a mine cave-in where he'd risked his life to save trapped workers, suffering severe burns from an underground fire in the process. "Didn't feel like a choice at the time," he said when she praised his heroism. "Just saw men who needed help and did what anyone would do." But Maggie had lived long enough to know that not everyone would have made that choice, especially not when it meant accepting permanent disfigurement and pain. Caleb's scars told the story of a man who put others' welfare before his own safety, which explained a great deal about his current kindness to her family. As winter deepened and travel became impossible, their isolation created an intimacy that might have taken months to develop under normal circumstances. They shared meals, childcare duties, and the daily work of survival in ways that felt more like partnership than mere convenience. When Rose took her first tentative steps between the kitchen table and Caleb's outstretched arms, his whoop of delight was as loud as Maggie's. When Patrick developed a fever that had them both worried sick through a long night, Caleb's steady presence and practical knowledge were as comforting as any medicine. "We make a good team," Maggie said one snowy evening as they watched the twins play happily on a blanket near the fire. "Yes," Caleb agreed quietly. "We do." But even as their partnership deepened and their mutual affection grew more obvious, both were careful not to push too hard or assume too much. Maggie had been abandoned by circumstances beyond her control, while Caleb had lost his family to tragedy. Neither wanted to risk the fragile happiness they'd found by moving too quickly, or expecting more than the other was ready to give. The first real test of their arrangement came in late November, when a supply wagon managed to make it up the treacherous mountain trail before winter completely closed the passes. The driver brought mail, supplies, and news from the outside world, including inquiries about Maggie's fate from well-meaning folks in the valley town, who remembered Henrik's story about the stranded woman and babies. "There's talk of organizing a rescue party come spring," the driver informed them. "Folks are worried about what happened to you, ma'am. Some think you probably didn't survive the early storms." The moment forced both Maggie and Caleb to confront questions they'd been avoiding. Did she want to be rescued? Did he want her to stay? And what exactly was their relationship becoming after months of shared domestic life? "What do you want?" Caleb asked her directly after the supply wagon had departed. "Do you want to go back to town when spring comes?" Maggie looked around the cabin that had become more of a home than anywhere she'd ever lived, at the sewing room where she'd already begun creating beautiful clothes for mountain families, at the man who had shown her and her children more genuine care than anyone ever had. "Do you want us to go?" she asked instead of answering. "That's not what I asked," he said gently but firmly. This is your choice, Maggie, your life and your children's future. I won't try to influence you either way, but I need to know what you're thinking." The honesty and respect in his question deserved an equally honest answer. "I want to stay," she said simply. "Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this feels like home, because you feel like family, because I think we could build something good here together." The relief that crossed Caleb's scarred features was answer enough, but he spoke anyway. "I was hoping you'd say that. This place has been more alive in the past few months than it has since Elizabeth and Sarah died, and not just because of the babies, because of you, because of the way you make everything feel like it matters again." As snow continued to fall, outside their warm cabin, creating a perfect white blanket that would keep them isolated until spring, Maggie felt a deep sense of rightness about her decision. She'd come to these mountains seeking security through marriage to a stranger, but had found something far more valuable: a true partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and growing love that felt as solid as the mountains themselves. Spring arrived in the Colorado high country like a revelation, transforming their snow-locked world into a symphony of rushing water, budding wildflowers, and the return of birdsong that had been absent through the long winter months. Maggie stood at the cabin's front window, watching Rose and Patrick play in a patch of sunlight that streamed through the open door, marveling at how much they'd grown during their months of mountain isolation. At nearly a year old, both twins were walking confidently and beginning to form their first words. Rose had developed a particular fascination with Caleb's wood-carving tools, while Patrick showed an uncanny ability to find and collect interesting stones during their daily walks around the valley. Both children treated Caleb with the easy affection of beloved family, calling him Kaka in their limited vocabulary and reaching for him whenever he entered the room. The transformation in their small family had been profound, but it was the change in Maggie herself that surprised her most. The desperate, frightened woman who had arrived with nothing but hope and determination had evolved into someone she barely recognized. Her hands, once soft from indoor work, were now capable and strong from mountain living. Her mind, always quick, had expanded to encompass skills she'd never imagined needing, from preserving meat to identifying edible plants to assisting Caleb with minor medical emergencies that arose in their isolated community. Most importantly, her heart had healed from the wounds of loss and abandonment, opening to possibilities she'd thought permanently closed to her. Watching Caleb teach Patrick to whittle his first stick, or seeing him patiently braid Rose's hair each morning, she understood that love could indeed bloom again. Different from what she'd known before, but no less real or valuable. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her peaceful morning observations. Through the window, she could see a small group of riders making their way up the valley trail, the first visitors they'd had since the supply wagon departed in early winter. Caleb emerged from the barn where he'd been repairing harness leather, his expression alert but not alarmed as he recognized the lead rider. "That's Sheriff Morrison from Pine Ridge," he called to Maggie, "probably checking on us after the winter, making sure we all survived." But as the riders drew closer, Maggie could see that this wasn't a casual wellness check. The sheriff's expression was grim, and the three men accompanying him had the hard look of men accustomed to trouble. Her stomach tightened with instinctive worry as she gathered the twins closer. Sheriff Morrison dismounted near the cabin porch, removing his hat with formal politeness, but keeping his hand near his sidearm in a gesture that suggested this wasn't entirely a friendly visit. "Morning, Stone," he said with a nod to Caleb. "Ma'am," he added, acknowledging Maggie with careful courtesy. "Hope you folks weathered the winter well." "Well enough," Caleb replied evenly. "What brings you up here, Morrison? It's a long ride for a social call." The sheriff's gaze moved deliberately from Caleb to Maggie to the children, taking in the domestic scene with calculating eyes. Had some interesting visitors in town last week. Couple of men from back east asking questions about a missing woman. And her twin babies. Said they represented concerned family members who'd hired investigators to track down their whereabouts. Maggie felt the blood drain from her face as the implications hit her. She'd left Boston believing she had no family, no one who would care about her fate. But Sean's older brother Patrick had always resented her marriage to his brother, claiming she was beneath their family's social standing if he'd somehow gained legal authority over her children. "What kind of questions?" Caleb asked, his tone carefully neutral despite the tension radiating from his posture. "The kind that suggest this lady might not be here entirely by her own choice," Morrison replied, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "See, the story they told was that Mrs. O'Brien here was mentally unstable after her husband's death, ran off with the babies in a state of confusion, and might be being held against her will by someone taking advantage of her condition." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Maggie realized with growing horror that Sean's brother had found a way to challenge her fitness as a mother, while simultaneously casting Caleb as either a kidnapper or someone exploiting a helpless woman. "That's absolutely false," she said, firmly, finding her voice despite her shock. "I came here of my own free will to marry Thomas Brennan. When that became impossible, Mr. Stone offered shelter and employment. No one has held me against my will or taken advantage of my situation." One of Morrison's companions, a lean man with cold eyes and expensive clothes that marked him as an Easterner, urged his horse forward. "I'm Detective Raymond Walsh, hired by Mr. Patrick O'Brien to locate his missing sister-in-law and nephews. Ma'am, we understand you may have been through traumatic experiences that could affect your judgment. Mr. O'Brien is prepared to provide proper care for you and the children, including medical treatment if necessary." The careful phrasing revealed the true threat. Patrick O'Brien was claiming she was mentally incompetent, using the twins as leverage to force her return to Boston, where he could control both her and whatever inheritance Sean might have left. It was a strategy that could work, especially if he'd managed to convince legal authorities that she was an unfit mother who had abandoned civilization in a state of mental breakdown. "I am perfectly capable of making my own decisions," Maggie declared, moving to stand beside Caleb in a gesture of unity that wasn't lost on anyone present. "My children are healthy, happy, and well cared for. I have no intention of returning to Boston or accepting Mr. O'Brien's questionable assistance." Detective Walsh's expression hardened. "Ma'am, with respect, living in isolation with an unmarried man is hardly proof of sound judgment. Mr. O'Brien has obtained preliminary custody documents based on evidence of abandonment and unsuitable living conditions. We're prepared to take the children into protective custody pending a formal hearing." The threat galvanized Caleb into action. He stepped forward, placing himself squarely between the detective and Maggie, his scarred face set in lines of implacable determination. "Those children aren't going anywhere," he said quietly, but his voice carried the unmistakable authority of a man who'd faced down mine disasters and wilderness predators. "And neither is their mother unless she chooses to go." "Mr. Stone," Sheriff Morrison said carefully, "I understand you've been helping this lady, but we're talking about legal custody matters here. If these men have proper documentation—" "What documentation?" Caleb demanded. "Papers signed by a man who wasn't present when his brother died, who never met these children, who has no knowledge of their mother's actual circumstances. Papers based on lies and manipulation designed to steal a woman's children." Detective Walsh reached into his coat, producing an official-looking document. This temporary custody order was issued by a Boston family court based on Mr. O'Brien's petition documenting abandonment, mental instability, and unsuitable living conditions. It gives us authority to remove the children pending a full hearing. Maggie felt the world tilting around her as she realized how cleverly Patrick O'Brien had maneuvered. By claiming she'd abandoned her responsibilities in a state of mental breakdown, he'd created a legal framework that painted her as an unfit mother, while positioning himself as the responsible family member acting in the children's best interests. "Let me see that," Caleb said, extending his hand for the document. His literacy surprised the detective, who had clearly expected to be dealing with an illiterate mountain man who could be easily intimidated. As Caleb read the custody order, his expression grew progressively darker. "This says the children's mother abandoned them to pursue an immoral relationship with an unknown man. It claims she's living in sin, in primitive conditions that endanger the children's health and welfare." He looked up, his eyes blazing with controlled fury. "Every word of this is a lie." "The court will determine the truth," Walsh replied, smoothly. "Our job is simply to execute the order and ensure the children's safety pending that determination." "Your job," a new voice interrupted from behind them, "is to follow proper legal procedures, which you're clearly not doing." Everyone turned to see a well-dressed woman approaching on horseback, her riding habit marking her as someone of education and means. She dismounted with practiced grace and approached the group with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to having her authority respected. "Dr. Catherine Whitmore," she announced, extending a leather portfolio. "I'm a physician and legal advocate from Denver, retained by the Territorial Women's Rights Association to investigate reports of custody, manipulation in remote areas." Detective Walsh's confident expression faltered as Dr. Whitmore continued. "I've been monitoring Mr. O'Brien's activities since receiving reports that he was using questionable legal tactics to gain control over his deceased brother's estate. The custody order you're carrying has no validity in Colorado territory, as it was issued without proper jurisdiction over either the children or their mother." She turned to Sheriff Morrison with professional courtesy but unmistakable authority. "Sheriff, I trust you'll want to verify the legitimacy of these proceedings before participating in what could amount to kidnapping under territorial law." Morrison looked uncomfortable as the legal ground shifted beneath his feet. "Ma'am, if there are jurisdictional questions—" "There are indeed," Dr. Whitmore confirmed crisply. "Mrs. O'Brien is a Colorado Territory resident who has committed no crime and shown no evidence of mental incompetence. Her children are demonstrably healthy and well cared for. Any custody proceeding would need to be initiated in territorial courts with proper evidence and due process." Detective Walsh's professional composure was beginning to crack. "Dr. Whitmore, Mr. O'Brien has invested considerable resources in locating his family members. Surely some accommodation can be reached." "The accommodation," Dr. Whitmore replied, coolly, "is for Mr. O'Brien to abandon his illegal attempts at custody manipulation and respect Mrs. O'Brien's right to determine her own living arrangements and her children's welfare." As the legal confrontation continued, Maggie found herself marveling at the unexpected turn of events. Just when she'd thought her carefully built new life was about to be destroyed by Patrick O'Brien's machinations, help had arrived from a source she'd never anticipated. Dr. Whitmore's presence meant that women in the territory were organizing to protect each other from exactly the kind of legal abuse Patrick was attempting. But it was Caleb's reaction that moved her most profoundly. Without hesitation, he had placed himself between her family and those who would harm them, willing to face down armed men and legal authorities to protect what they'd built together. His loyalty wasn't based on legal obligations or social expectations, but on the deep bonds of affection and commitment that had grown between them through months of shared struggle and mutual support. "Mrs. O'Brien," Dr. Whitmore said, turning to address her directly, I'd like to examine your children and document their current health and welfare. Would that be acceptable?" "Of course," Maggie replied gratefully. "Rose and Patrick are in excellent health, but I welcome any professional assessment." The examination that followed was thorough and professional. Dr. Whitmore documented the twins' physical development, their obvious comfort with both their mother and Caleb, and the clean, well-organized conditions of their mountain home. She also took careful notes about Maggie's own mental state, asking detailed questions about her decision-making process and future plans. "These children show every sign of excellent care," Dr. Whitmore announced when her examination was complete. "They're healthy, appropriately developed for their age, and demonstrate secure attachments to their caregivers. I see no evidence of neglect, endangerment, or any other factors that would justify custody intervention." Detective Walsh made one final attempt to salvage his mission. "Doctor, while the children may appear healthy now, the moral implications of this living arrangement are none of your business," Dr. Whitmore cut him off sharply. "Mrs. O'Brien's personal relationships are her own concern, provided they don't endanger her children's welfare. Since you've presented no evidence of such endangerment, your mission here is complete." Sheriff Morrison, clearly relieved to have a face-saving way out of an increasingly complicated situation, stepped forward. "Well then, gentlemen, it appears we have no legal grounds to proceed. I suggest we head back to town." As the frustrated investigators prepared to depart, Detective Walsh delivered one final threat. "This isn't over, Mrs. O'Brien. Mr. O'Brien has considerable resources and determination. He won't give up easily." "Neither will we," Caleb said quietly, his arm moving protectively around Maggie's shoulders. "And unlike Mr. O'Brien, we have truth and law on our side." After the riders disappeared down the mountain trail, Dr. Whitmore accepted Maggie's invitation to stay for dinner and rest before beginning her own journey back to Denver. Over the evening meal, she explained how women throughout the territory were organizing to protect each other from the kind of legal manipulation Patrick O'Brien had attempted. "Too many women have lost their children to family members who see them as property rather than people," Dr. Whitmore explained. "Men who use the law's bias against women to gain control over estates, inheritances, or simply to punish women for making choices they disapprove of." "But you stopped them," Maggie said gratefully. "How did you even know to come here?" Dr. Whitmore smiled. "The Territorial Women's Network is more extensive than most people realize. When word reached us about Eastern investigators seeking a woman and children in the high country, we made inquiries. Your story isn't uncommon, unfortunately, but your outcome may be different because you have allies." That night, as Maggie settled the twins in their cribs and prepared for bed, she reflected on how completely her life had been transformed. A year ago, she'd been a desperate widow, fleeing poverty and hopelessness. Tonight, she was a woman with a home, a profession, a partner who would stand against any threat to protect their family, and allies she'd never known existed fighting to protect her rights. The threats from Patrick O'Brien weren't over, she knew. Men like him didn't abandon their schemes easily, especially when significant money was involved. But for the first time since Sean's death, she felt truly powerful, supported by people who valued her autonomy and her children's welfare above social conventions or legal technicalities. As she drifted off to sleep in the bed that had become truly hers, she could hear Caleb moving quietly around the cabin, checking locks and ensuring their security. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she rested in the knowledge that she was no longer alone against the world. The morning brought unexpected visitors once again, but this time the approach was announced by children's laughter rather than the grim purpose of law enforcement. A family of homesteaders from the next valley had made the trek to bring their eldest daughter for the new seamstress services they'd heard about through the mountain community's informal communication network. The Hendersons had heard about Maggie's skills from the supply wagon driver, who had carried word of the excellent alterations she'd done for several families throughout the region. Now they'd brought 14-year-old Mary Henderson, whose growth spurt had left her with no properly fitting clothes for the upcoming community harvest celebration. "Heard tell you can make a dress that'll turn heads at the social," Mrs. Henderson said hopefully as she examined the beautifully organized sewing room that had become Maggie's professional domain. "I can certainly try," Maggie replied, studying. The tall, awkward teenager who was clearly self-conscious about her recent physical changes. "Mary, what kind of dress makes you feel confident and beautiful?" The question surprised the girl, who was accustomed to having clothes chosen for her based on practicality rather than personal preference. As they discussed colors, styles, and fabrics, Maggie saw the transformation that occurred when a young woman realized she had choices and that her opinions mattered. The fitting session became an impromptu lesson in confidence and self-worth, with Maggie explaining how proper fit could enhance Mary's natural grace while teaching her basic principles of color and style that would serve her throughout her life. By the time the Hendersons departed, with plans to return in a week for the finished dress, Mary was standing straighter and smiling more brightly. "You're not just making clothes," Caleb observed that evening as Maggie worked on Mary's dress pattern. "You're teaching these girls that they deserve to feel beautiful." "Every woman deserves that," Maggie replied, carefully cutting the blue fabric that would complement Mary's eyes. "Too often, we're told that vanity is sinful or that our appearance doesn't matter. But feeling good about how you look changes how you move through the world, how you value yourself." It was this philosophy that was making Maggie's seamstress business more than just a commercial venture. Word was spreading throughout the mountain communities about the woman who didn't just alter clothes to fit bodies, but who helped other women discover their own sense of style and self-worth. The spring of 1885 brought transformations to the Colorado high country that extended far beyond the seasonal melting of snow and emergence of wildflowers. Word had spread throughout the territory about the Mountain Women's Cooperative, drawing attention from unexpected quarters and creating opportunities that none of them had anticipated when they'd first gathered to discuss shared sewing projects. Maggie stood in what had once been Elizabeth's sewing room, now expanded into the cabin's main gathering space to accommodate the monthly cooperative meetings. 12 women from across the mountain region sat around tables laden with fabric samples, pattern pieces, and the intricate beadwork that had become their signature specialty. What had begun as a survival strategy for struggling families had evolved into something approaching a small industry. "The order from Denver is our largest yet," Maggie announced, consulting the carefully organized ledger that tracked their collective business. 50 wedding dresses for a department store, plus matching accessories. They're offering to pay premium prices because word has reached the city about the quality of mountain craftsmanship. Sarah Matthews, whose confidence had grown dramatically since joining the cooperative, looked up from the delicate lacework she was creating. "My John says the mine supervisor's wife specifically requested one of our dresses for her daughter's wedding. Said she'd heard the mountain seamstresses could make any woman look like royalty." The transformation in Sarah had been remarkable to witness. From a desperate woman facing destitution, she'd become one of the cooperative's most skilled artisans, and a natural leader who mentored newer members. Her husband John's recovery from his mining injuries had been aided not just by time and proper medical care, but by the restoration of dignity that came from his wife's successful contributions to their family's financial stability. "There's something else," Maggie continued, her voice carrying a note of excitement that made all the women look up expectantly. "I received a letter from Mrs. Adelaide Morrison in San Francisco. She represents a consortium of women investors who are interested in expanding successful female-owned businesses throughout the Western Territories. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Martha Peterson was the first to find her voice. Investors? You mean people who would give us money to expand what we're doing? More than that, Maggie explained, unfolding the elegant letterhead that had arrived with the previous week's mail delivery. They're proposing to establish a network of women's cooperatives throughout Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana territories. Our group would serve as the model and training center for other communities that want to start similar enterprises. Elena Rodriguez, whose seasonal ranch income had been supplemented year-round by her embroidery skills, leaned forward eagerly. What would that mean for us, for our families? Maggie consulted her notes, trying to contain her own excitement as she shared the details. It would mean regular income for all of us, teacher positions for those who want to train women in other communities, and eventually the possibility of opening an actual school for textile arts and women's business skills. The vision was breathtaking in its scope and implications. Rather than simply surviving on the margins of mountain society, they would be creating institutions that could transform how women throughout the Western Territories supported themselves and their families. But it was Ruth Hendricks, the newest and youngest member of their group, who asked the question that went to the heart of their concerns. What about our families, our children? If we become this successful, this visible, won't it change everything about how we live? The 18-year-old had joined the cooperative after her husband was killed in a logging accident, leaving her with a 6-month-old baby and no means of support. Her question reflected the fears of women who had found security in their small mountain communities and worried about the changes that expanded success might bring. Change isn't something that happens to us, Maggie replied gently but firmly. Change is something we create through our choices and actions. We can shape this opportunity to serve our needs and values rather than letting it reshape us in ways we don't want. The discussion that followed revealed the depth of thoughtfulness these women brought to decisions that would affect not just their own lives, but their children's futures. They weren't simply eager for financial success. They were determined to build something sustainable that would honor their families and communities while creating genuine opportunities for the next generation. As the meeting progressed, Caleb appeared in the doorway with Rose and Patrick, both now energetic toddlers who had learned to play quietly during their mother's business meetings. The sight of him patiently managing both children while Maggie focused on her work served as a powerful reminder of how their unconventional family arrangement had evolved to support everyone's dreams and ambitions. Papa Kaka, Rose called out, using the name she'd developed for Caleb that had stuck despite Maggie's attempts to teach her more formal address. Patrick immediately echoed his sister, and both children ran to the man who had become their father in every meaningful sense. Watching Caleb gather both twins into his arms with practiced ease, Maggie felt a familiar surge of gratitude for the partnership they'd built. His support for her business ventures had never wavered, even when success meant increased demands on her time and attention. He understood that her work gave her a sense of purpose and accomplishment that made her a better partner and mother. "Ladies," Caleb said with a courteous nod to the assembled women, "I hate to interrupt, but there are visitors approaching. Looks like official business of some kind." The mood in the room shifted immediately as memories of previous unwelcome visits created tension. Through the window they could see a small group of riders approaching the cabin, their formal clothing and purposeful manner suggesting this wasn't a casual social call. But as the riders drew closer, Maggie recognized Dr. Catherine Whitmore's distinctive riding habit and felt relief wash over her. The physician was accompanied by 2 other well-dressed women and a man in a business suit who carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to being taken seriously and professional. "Settings, Dr. Whitmore," Maggie greeted warmly as she stepped onto the cabin's front porch. What brings you back to our valley? Business, the doctor replied with a smile that suggested good news rather than trouble. I'd like you to meet Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, whom I believe you've been corresponding with, her business partner Mrs. Victoria Ashford, and territorial representative James Sullivan. The introductions revealed that Maggie's visitors represented not just business opportunities, but significant political connections. James Sullivan's presence suggested that their women's cooperative had attracted attention from territorial authorities, who were interested in economic development initiatives. As they settled around the cabin's main room for what was clearly going to be an important discussion, Maggie found herself serving tea to people who might determine the future direction of everything she'd built in the mountains. Mrs. Stone, Mrs. Morrison began, using the married name that Maggie had adopted after her wedding to Caleb the previous month. Your cooperative has achieved something remarkable in a very short time. We're not just interested in replicating your business model. We're interested in understanding how you've created such strong community support and sustainable economic growth. The questions that followed revealed the sophisticated thinking behind their expansion proposal. These weren't simply investors looking for quick profits. They were women who understood the broader implications of female economic independence and were committed to building institutions that would survive and thrive over generations. The challenge, Mrs. Ashford explained, is scaling success without losing the personal connections and mutual support that make these cooperatives work. Too many business ventures fail when they grow beyond the founder's direct involvement. That's why we're proposing a different model, Mr. Sullivan added. Rather than one large organization, we envision a network of autonomous cooperatives that share resources, training, and market access while maintaining their local character and community roots. The vision they outlined was sophisticated and inspiring. Regional training centers where women could learn advanced skills, coordinated marketing that would give mountain crafts access to urban markets throughout the western United States. Financial systems that would provide credit and investment opportunities specifically designed for women-owned enterprises. But it was the educational component of their proposal that captured Maggie's imagination most completely. They were suggesting the establishment of a formal school for women's business and technical education, with their mountain cooperative serving as the practical training ground where students would learn by doing real work for real customers. Think of it, Dr. Whitmore said enthusiastically. Young women from throughout the territory coming here to learn not just sewing and crafts, but accounting, business management, marketing, and leadership skills. Then, returning to their own communities to establish similar enterprises. The implications were staggering. Rather than being an isolated mountain community struggling on the margins of territorial society, they would become the center of a movement that could transform how women throughout the American West supported themselves and their families. As the afternoon progressed and the details of the proposal became clearer, Maggie found herself both excited and apprehensive about the magnitude of change being suggested. Success on this scale would mean visibility, responsibility, and challenges she could barely imagine. But it was Caleb's reaction that helped her put the opportunity in perspective. During a break in the formal discussions, he drew her aside for a private conversation. "This is what you were meant to do," he said simply. "I've watched you grow from someone grateful for basic survival into someone who creates opportunities for others. This proposal isn't asking you to become someone different. It's asking you to become more fully yourself." His confidence in her abilities meant more than all the business projections and financial incentives the investors had presented. Caleb had seen her at her most vulnerable and had watched her transform challenge into opportunity repeatedly. His belief that she could handle even greater responsibilities gave her the courage to embrace possibilities that might have seemed overwhelming otherwise. The decision to accept the expansion proposal wasn't made that afternoon, but the foundation was laid for what would become the Mountain Women's Institute, with Maggie as its founding director and the Cabin Valley as its headquarters. The investors agreed to phase the development over several years, allowing the existing cooperative to adapt gradually rather than being overwhelmed by sudden change. As her visitors prepared to depart, Mrs. Morrison made an observation that would stay with Maggie long after the horses had disappeared down the mountain trail. "What you've accomplished here isn't just about business success," she said. "You've proven that women can create economic independence without sacrificing family values or community connections. That's a model the entire nation needs to see." That evening, as Maggie and Caleb sat on their porch watching Rose and Patrick play in the wildflower meadow that surrounded their cabin, they discussed the transformations their quiet mountain life was about to undergo. "Are you ready for all this?" Caleb asked, his arm around her shoulders, as they watched their children chase butterflies in the golden evening light. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," Maggie replied with quiet confidence. "But more importantly, I'm ready to face it with you, with our family, with the community we've built here." The summer that followed brought a steady stream of visitors as word spread about the Mountain Women's Institute and its innovative approach to female education and economic development. Young women arrived from towns and cities throughout the territory, eager to learn skills that would give them alternatives to traditional domestic dependence. But it was the visit from her sister-in-law that provided the most profound confirmation of how completely Maggie's life had been transformed. Catherine O'Brien arrived unannounced in late August, traveling from Boston with her teenage daughter and a carefully rehearsed speech about family reconciliation. "Margaret," Catherine said formally, as she stepped down from the hired wagon that had brought her up the mountain trail, "I've come to discuss family matters and to see my brother's children." The woman who faced Maggie bore little resemblance to the desperate widow who had fled Boston 2 years earlier. Confident, successful, surrounded by the evidence of her accomplishments and the love of her chosen family, Maggie no longer felt intimidated by representatives of the life she'd left behind. "Catherine," she replied with polite courtesy, "you're welcome here, of course. Though I should mention that Patrick O'Brien's previous attempts to interfere with my family were unsuccessful and unwelcome." "I'm not here on Patrick's behalf," Catherine said quickly. "I'm here because I've heard remarkable things about what you've accomplished, and because I wanted to see for myself whether the reports could possibly be true." The conversation that followed revealed that word of the Mountain Women's Institute had reached even Boston's social circles, where Maggie's transformation from abandoned widow to successful entrepreneur had become the subject of considerable discussion and some embarrassment for those who had dismissed her potential. But it was Catherine's reaction to meeting Rose and Patrick that provided the most satisfaction. The children, who Patrick O'Brien had tried to claim were endangered by their unconventional upbringing, were clearly thriving in ways that spoke to excellent care, loving attention, and secure attachment to their parents. "They're beautiful," Catherine admitted as she watched Caleb patiently teach Patrick to carve his first wooden toy, while Rose helped by organizing wood shavings into careful piles. "And so obviously happy and loved." "They have a wonderful father," Maggie said, simply, her gaze resting on the man who had embraced her children as completely as if they shared his blood. "And they're growing up in a community that values both education and practical skills, where they see women and men working together as equals." The week-long visit provided Catherine with a comprehensive introduction to mountain life and the Institute's educational philosophy. She observed classes where young women learned everything from advanced needlework to basic business accounting, She met families throughout the valley whose economic stability had been transformed by women's increased earning capacity. Most importantly, she witnessed firsthand the deep respect and affection that existed between Maggie and Caleb, the easy partnership that allowed both to pursue their individual interests while building something meaningful together. "I owe you an apology," Catherine said on the morning of her departure. "I allowed Patrick to convince me that you were making a terrible mistake coming west, that you were endangering the children and abandoning your responsibilities. I can see now that you were doing exactly the opposite. You were creating opportunities and building a better future than anything Boston could have offered." The acknowledgement meant more to Maggie than she had expected. Validation from her former life provided a sense of completion, confirmation that her choices had been vindicated not just by personal happiness, but by objective measures of success and accomplishment. As autumn approached and the Institute prepared for its first formal graduation ceremony, Maggie reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from desperate mail-order bride to respected educator and community leader. The cabin that had been built for another woman's dreams had become the foundation for dreams none of them could have imagined. Standing in the expanded workshop where 20 young women from across the territory were putting finishing touches on projects that would launch their own business ventures, surrounded by the evidence of what determination and mutual support could accomplish, Maggie felt profound gratitude for every twist of fate that had led her to this moment. The graduation ceremony itself became a celebration not just of individual achievements, but of collective possibility. Families traveled from across the mountain region to honor daughters, sisters, and wives who had transformed themselves from economic dependence into capable entrepreneurs ready to create their own opportunities. But it was the speech given by Mary Henderson, now a confident young woman preparing to establish her own dressmaking business in a distant mining town, that captured the true significance of what they had accomplished together. "2 years ago, I was just a farm girl who dreamed of pretty dresses," Mary said to the assembled crowd. "Today, I'm a businesswoman with the skills and knowledge to support myself and eventually my own family. But more than that, I'm part of a network of women who believe in each other's potential and will support each other's success wherever our paths may lead." As applause filled the mountain air and families celebrated achievements that had seemed impossible just months earlier, Maggie understood that they had created something far more valuable than a successful business or educational institution. They had proven that women could redefine their own possibilities and create institutions that served their values while achieving their ambitions. The future stretched ahead, filled with challenges and opportunities they could barely imagine. But Maggie faced it with the confidence that came from having built something real and lasting with people she loved and trusted. The mountains that had once seemed harsh and forbidding now felt like home in the deepest sense, not just a place to live, but a place where dreams could take root and flourish beyond anything that conventional society might have deemed possible. The winter of 1886 brought news that would test everything Maggie and her community had built over the previous 3 years. A telegram arrived on the last supply wagon before the mountain passes closed for the season, bearing information that made Maggie's hands tremble as she read the carefully worded message. The federal government is proposing new territorial regulations that could significantly impact women's business ownership and educational institutions, she read aloud to Caleb as they sat by the fire after putting Rose and Patrick to bed. Congressional hearings are scheduled for spring to discuss limitations on female commercial enterprises in frontier territories. The implications were staggering. Political forces in Washington, influenced by conservative business interests and traditional social organizations, were responding to the success of women's cooperatives throughout the Western Territories by attempting to regulate them out of existence. The Mountain Women's Institute had become too visible, too successful, too much of a challenge to conventional assumptions about women's proper roles. "They can't simply outlaw women working," Caleb said, though his expression revealed concern about exactly what congressional authority might accomplish. "Half the businesses in these territories depend on women's labor." "They don't need to outlaw women working," Maggie replied grimly, studying the detailed legal analysis that Dr. Whitmore had included with the telegram. "They just need to create regulations that make independent women's businesses impossible to operate legally. Licensing requirements we can't meet, educational standards we can't fulfill, property ownership restrictions that prevent us from controlling our own enterprises." The strategy was sophisticated and potentially devastating. By creating bureaucratic barriers disguised as quality control measures, federal authorities could effectively eliminate women's economic independence without the political cost of explicitly discriminating against female entrepreneurs. But as word of the federal threat spread throughout their mountain network during the long winter months, something remarkable happened. Rather than retreating in fear or abandoning their hard-won progress, the women of the cooperative began organizing a response that would demonstrate the true scope of what they had accomplished. "We need to document everything," declared Sarah Matthews during the emergency meeting held in Maggie's expanded cabin on the first day travel became possible after the worst of the winter storms passed. "Every business we've started, every family we've helped, every young woman we've trained, they want to regulate us. Let them try to regulate success that's already transformed dozens of communities." The documentation project that followed revealed the extraordinary scope of their impact across the mountain territories. In 3 years, their network had trained over 200 women in advanced business and craft skills. These women had established enterprises in 47 different communities, creating employment for hundreds of families and contributing thousands of dollars to local economies. More significantly, the communities with women's cooperatives showed measurably better outcomes in child health, family stability, and economic resilience compared to similar communities without such organizations. The women hadn't just created businesses. They had created social infrastructure that strengthened entire regions. "The numbers tell a story politicians will have to acknowledge," observed Martha Peterson, who had developed remarkable skills in business analysis during her years with the cooperative. "Communities with our programs have lower rates of family abandonment, higher literacy rates among children, and more diversified local economies. We're not just making money, we're making better places to live." As spring approached and the time for congressional hearings drew closer, Maggie found herself facing a decision that would determine not just her own future, but the future of everything they had built together. Dr. Whitmore arrived with an invitation that was both an honor and a tremendous responsibility. "The Territorial Women's Rights Association wants you to testify before Congress," Dr. Whitmore announced during her visit to coordinate their response strategy. "Your institute has become the most visible and successful example of women's economic organization in the Western Territories. Your testimony could influence whether these regulatory proposals succeed or fail." The invitation meant traveling to Washington for several months, leaving behind not just her family, but the community that depended on her leadership during their most critical period. It meant facing down congressional committees, hostile questioning, and political forces that had far more resources and experience than a mountain seamstress turned educator. But it also meant the opportunity to speak for women throughout the territories who had found hope and purpose through the opportunities they had created together. Women like Ruth Hendricks, who had transformed from helpless widow to successful business owner, young women like Mary Henderson who were building futures that previous generations couldn't have imagined. "I'll go," Maggie decided without hesitation. "But not alone. If Congress wants to understand what we've accomplished, they need to hear from more than just one voice." The delegation that formed around Maggie's testimony included Sarah Matthews, representing the transformation of struggling families, Mary Henderson, speaking for the young women whose futures had been expanded, Dr. Whitmore, providing medical and social analysis, and most importantly, Elena Rodriguez, whose bilingual skills and cultural background could speak to the diverse communities that benefited from their programs. But it was Caleb's reaction to her decision that provided the emotional foundation for the challenges ahead. Rather than expressing concern about the months of separation or the political risks involved, he focused entirely on her preparation and success. "You're going to change how they think about women's capabilities," he said, with quiet confidence as they planned her travel arrangements. "Not just because of what you'll say, but because of who you are and what you represent. They're expecting to meet some radical troublemaker. Instead, they'll meet a successful businesswoman, devoted mother, and respected community leader who happens to be female." The journey to Washington in early spring of 1887 was itself a testament to how much the Western territories had developed since Maggie's desperate arrival 3 years earlier. Railroad connections that hadn't existed when she'd traveled west now provided relatively comfortable passage, and the women's delegation found themselves part of a larger movement of territorial representatives converging on the capital to advocate for Western interests. The boarding house where they stayed near the Capitol building bustled with territorial delegates, business representatives, and advocacy groups, creating an atmosphere of political energy that was both exciting and intimidating. For women accustomed to mountain isolation, the sheer scale and intensity of Washington politics required significant adjustment. But it was the reaction of other guests at their boarding house that provided the first indication of how their presence would be received. Word spread quickly that the delegation included the founder of the famous Mountain Women's Institute, and Maggie found herself fielding questions from journalists, politicians, and curious citizens who had heard conflicting reports about their work. "Is it true that your institute teaches women to abandon their families?" asked a stern-faced congressman's wife during dinner conversation. "The reports we've received suggest these cooperatives encourage women to neglect their domestic duties." Quite the opposite," Maggie replied calmly, having anticipated such questions. "Our programs help women better support their families by developing skills that provide economic security. Women who can contribute financially to their households are more likely to maintain stable families, not less." The informal conversations that preceded the formal hearings revealed the depth of misunderstanding and deliberate misrepresentation that surrounded their work. Conservative opponents had created a narrative that portrayed women's cooperatives as threats to family stability and social order, while completely ignoring the evidence of their positive community impact. But these preliminary discussions also revealed unexpected allies among politicians and business leaders who recognized the economic value of women's enterprises. Territorial development depended on attracting and retaining stable populations, and communities with thriving women's cooperatives demonstrated exactly the kind of economic diversification and social stability that federal policy should encourage. The congressional hearing itself took place in a committee room that emphasized the formal power of federal authority. Maggie and her delegation sat at a small table facing a raised platform where committee members could look down at witnesses, a physical arrangement designed to reinforce the power dynamics involved. But Maggie had faced down armed investigators, legal threats, and community opposition for years. Congressional intimidation tactics seemed almost quaint, compared to the real challenges of building businesses and institutions from nothing in an isolated mountain valley. Mrs. Stone, the committee chairman, began with formal courtesy that barely concealed skepticism. You represent an organization that some critics claim undermines traditional family structures and creates economic competition that threatens established businesses. How do you respond to such concerns? With evidence, Maggie replied simply, gesturing to the carefully organized documentation her delegation had prepared. The Mountain Women's Institute and associated cooperatives have created over 300 jobs in regions where economic opportunities were previously limited. These enterprises have contributed more than $50,000 to local economies while maintaining family stability rates higher than comparable communities. The statistics were impressive, but it was the personal testimonies that followed that transformed the hearing's atmosphere. Sarah Matthews described how the cooperative had saved her family from destitution while allowing her to care for her injured husband and 3 children. Mary Henderson explained how her business training had enabled her to support her elderly parents while building a successful enterprise that employed other young women. Dr. Whitmore presented medical evidence showing improved health outcomes in communities with women's cooperatives, while Elena Rodriguez spoke eloquently about how these programs had helped immigrant families integrate into American economic life while maintaining their cultural identities. But it was the unexpected testimony from territorial business leaders that provided the most powerful support for their cause. 3 successful male entrepreneurs had traveled to Washington specifically to advocate for the women's cooperatives, arguing that these enterprises had strengthened rather than threatened the broader business community. "Gentlemen," declared Robert Harrison, owner of the largest supply company serving the Mountain Territories, "the women's cooperatives are among my best customers. They pay their bills promptly, order quality materials, and have created entirely new markets for products that benefit my business and dozens of others." The hearing continued for 3 days, with testimony from supporters and critics that revealed the complex political forces at work. Conservative organizations argued that women's economic independence threatened social stability, while territorial representatives emphasized the practical benefits of diversified economic development. But it was the final exchange between Maggie and the committee chairman that captured the fundamental issue at stake. After hours of technical testimony about regulations and economic impact, the chairman asked a direct question that went to the heart of their opponent's concerns. "Mrs. Stone, do you believe that women's commercial success requires them to abandon traditional roles as wives and mothers?" "Senator," Maggie replied, looking directly at each committee member in turn, "I believe that women's commercial success enables them to be better wives and mothers. Financial security reduces family stress. Economic skills provide protection against poverty and abandonment. Educational opportunities create better conditions for raising children." She paused, then continued with quiet conviction that filled the formal chamber. "The women in our cooperatives aren't abandoning traditional values. They're fulfilling them more completely by ensuring their families have the resources and stability needed to thrive." The Congressional Committee's final report, issued 6 weeks after the hearings concluded, represented a stunning victory for women's business rights throughout the territories. Rather than implementing restrictive regulations, Congress recommended federal support for women's educational and economic programs that demonstrated positive community impact. The report specifically cited the Mountain Women's Institute as a model for sustainable development that combined traditional values with innovative economic strategies. Federal funding was authorized for expansion of similar programs throughout the Western Territories, with Maggie's organization designated as a regional training center. The telegram announcing the committee's decision reached the mountain valley on a brilliant summer morning when the wildflowers were at their peak, and the air rang with children's laughter from the Institute's expanded facilities. As Maggie read, the news aloud to the assembled community, the cheers that erupted could be heard echoing off the surrounding peaks. But it was the private celebration that evening, with just her immediate family gathered around their cabin's familiar fireplace, that provided the deepest satisfaction. Rose and Patrick, now energetic 4-year-olds, played contentedly with the wooden toys that Caleb continued to carve for them, while their parents reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment of triumph. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Thomas Brennan's cabin hadn't burned down?" Caleb asked, as they watched their children's innocent pleasure in simple toys and each other's company. "Sometimes," Maggie admitted, "but I think we would have found each other eventually. Some partnerships are just meant to be." The success in Washington opened doors to opportunities they had never imagined when they first began their small cooperative. Invitations arrived from women's organizations throughout the United States, requesting Maggie to speak about their model and assist in establishing similar programs. Publishers wanted to document their story for national distribution. Investors proposed expansion plans that could create a nationwide network of women's educational and business institutions. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. A letter from Elizabeth's sister in Boston, who had followed Maggie's journey through newspaper accounts and wanted to express her family's gratitude for honoring Elizabeth's memory through the work at the Institute. Elizabeth always believed that women had unlimited potential if given proper opportunities, the letter read. She would be proud to know that her home became the foundation for proving that belief correct, and she would be grateful that her husband found love again with someone who shared her vision of what women could accomplish. As autumn approached, and the Institute prepared for its largest graduation class yet, Maggie stood in the expanded workshop where 50 young women from across the nation were completing their training programs. The Cabin Valley that had once seemed like the end of the world had become a destination for women seeking to transform their lives and their communities. The sounds of industry filled the mountain air, sewing machines humming, looms clicking, young voices discussing business plans and marketing strategies. But underneath it all was something even more valuable: the sound of women discovering their own capabilities and supporting each other's dreams. The graduation ceremony that year included representatives from federal agencies, territorial governments, and women's organizations from coast to coast. But the most important attendees were the families who had traveled great distances to celebrate. Daughters, sisters, and wives who had transformed not just their own prospects, but the possibilities for future generations. As Maggie delivered the keynote address to the largest audience ever assembled in their mountain valley, she reflected on the journey from desperate mail-order bride to nationally recognized leader. But more than personal transformation, she understood that they had proven something fundamental about human potential and the power of communities built on mutual support and shared vision. 3 years ago, she told the assembled crowd, I arrived in this valley with nothing but hope and determination. Today, we celebrate not just individual achievements, but collective proof that women can create institutions that serve their communities while fulfilling their own potential. The applause that followed seemed to echo from the surrounding peaks, a sound of celebration that would carry far beyond the mountain valley into a future bright with possibilities they had helped create. As the formal ceremony concluded and families began their journeys home, carrying with them not just diplomas, but expanded visions of what their daughters and communities could become, Maggie felt the deep satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful that would outlast its founders. The sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in brilliant colors that reflected off the snow-covered summits, creating a natural cathedral that seemed to bless the work they had accomplished together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight was for celebration of how far they had traveled from that desperate winter when a scarred mountain man had offered shelter to a woman and children with nowhere else to go. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.